The number one thing, which is the same for any rollout initiative, is the why. So why are we rolling out AI? What are we hoping to get? And then setting clear expectations for what that means for the team. An engineer said, look, when a peer tells me I should do it, I know that it's going to make things easier. It's something that will help me in my job. But when the CTO says I should do it, I wonder if it's just that they think they're going to make more money or that the shareholders will make more money. And so there's the skepticism when leadership says it versus when a peer says, look, I tried something and it worked. Engineers now moving more into product work. In some companies, that's actually become the blocker, right? Is there's not enough product work. And so you can build the thing faster, but if you haven't done the research to know what you need to build, then that's you're stuck there.
Welcome to the Tech Waka podcast, where we dive into the journeys of New Zealand's top tech leaders. Your host for today is Jakob, bringing you conversations with tech leaders and innovators from across Aotearoa. Join us as we uncover the experiences, challenges, and successes that shape our tech community. This episode of the Tech Waka podcast is proudly brought to you by Wires Uncrossed, lifting the standard of software delivery across New Zealand, Australia, and beyond. A big thanks to Wires Uncrossed for supporting the Tech Waka mission and backing the voices of our tech leadership community. To learn more, go to wiresuncrossed.co.nz.
Did you know that when engineering teams roll out AI coding tools, they merge 27% more pull requests, but they also do 20% more out-of-hours work? So how much of that productivity gain is actually AI, and how much is just people working longer hours? Peate, founder and CEO of Multitudes, decided to find out. She and her team spent over a year researching how AI is really impacting engineering teams, not based on hype or headlines, but on actual telemetry data, surveys, and in-depth interviews across hundreds of organizations. What she found out is that the tool doesn't matter nearly as much as we think. What matters is how leaders support their teams through that transition, the clarity of goals, the space for learning, and the practices you protect along the way. We talk about why peer-to-peer learning matters more than mandates, why senior engineers pull back away from AI under delivery pressure while juniors lean in, and why most organizations are focusing on the wrong things when it comes to getting value from AI. This is a conversation full of practical insights for engineering leaders navigating AI right now. Let's get into it. Hi, Lauren. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Very good. It's great to have you on the podcast. I remember you being one of the most energetic participants of our Beacon conference last year. It's great to have you here because I've been following you on LinkedIn and I could see how much research you've been doing in software engineering, software development, and especially in AI and agentic ways of software development. So great to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And I had a great time at the conference. So thank you so much for running it.
Let's just jump into it. You're on Multitudes, which is a coach for software developers, software teams. Is that the case?
It's a SaaS product and our bigger goal is to turn engineering metrics into a tool for continuous improvement. So
Awesome.
Instead of just dashboards that an exec rolls out for a board meeting, it's a living practice that teams are using themselves to set goals and run experiments.
Yeah. As part of that role, you guys are running different research. And I remember that you published a paper, What Matters Most for AI Rollout, How You Lead. And I found it really fascinating. Can you tell us a bit more about how it kind of came about and the methods you use and the key results?
I'll start with the research motivation. And the main research motivation was that AI is, of course, reshaping how software is getting built. And so we knew we needed to have features in Multitudes that reflected that. But something that's always been really important to us is making sure that the work that we do is research-backed. And so when we looked at the existing research around how is AI impacting software engineering teams, there was every answer under the sun. And there's everything from, there's a Microsoft-backed Copilot study. The most cited, it's one of the earlier ones though too, 2023, that says that it made engineers 55.6% faster.
Look at that.
All the way, yeah, I know, wow. What are we doing now? And then all the way to the Meter study last year, which was controversial, but one of the things that came out as an outcome of that was that engineers were actually getting 19% slower And interestingly, they had predicted that they would be 20% faster in surveys. So this tension between telemetry data and survey data. And so anyway, critiques of both of those papers aside, the main takeaway is that there wasn't a clear consensus. And so it meant that when we were thinking about what should we build, we didn't have good research-backed guidance. And being data nerds, the way that we like to solve that problem is by getting some data ourselves. And what we set up, we've now actually done 2 phases of the research. So we've been researching this topic for 15 months. We've got 2 white papers out on it. But I'll focus on the first phase of the research in that first white paper for now.
Nice.
So for that one, we went very deep. So we had 500 engineers at 4 different organizations that we followed over the course of 10 months. And what was great about it was 2 things. One, we followed them as they rolled out new AI tooling. And so in all of those cases, we were able to make sure that we had a good baseline of metrics before AI tools were rolled out. And then we saw what changed after. The second thing that was really good is that, in particular, kind of pushed on by the findings of the meter study, which showed that your survey data and your telemetry data could be quite different. We made sure that we were pulling in different methods and different data sources. And so we had telemetry data, both for the AI usage in those organizations. Also on the telemetry data side, we were pulling in some of the key engineering metrics, so DORA, space metrics. We also ran a survey. So about 40% of the folks that we had telemetry data for also filled out our survey. And then we did about 20 interviews. And that meant that interesting trends that we found in the telemetry data or the survey data, we could then dive deeper into.
When I was reading that research paper, there was a lot of interesting things. Can you tell us about some of the things that you found really interesting or maybe that resonated with you and people in the community?
The biggest thing, if I had to summarize all of the findings, the number one, where the title comes from, is that we saw different outcomes based on the actions that leaders took and how they were supporting their teams through this transition.
Sure.
And so that meant that on the adoption side, we saw the pace of adoption be very different across organizations, and it looked like it was linked to different enablement activities they did. We also, in general, saw very different outcomes across the DORA and space metrics, with 2 exceptions that were very consistent, which we'll come back to. But in general, we saw very different outcomes. And again, it really varied by organization and by team and their practices. And the last bright spot I'll say on this one is particularly around quality, which is for many still a worry. I have heard some of your kind of AI hype fueled folks, even in software engineering, say, oh, I don't worry about quality anymore because writing code is so cheap. But for those of us who still care about quality, one of the really bright spots we saw in that first paper was that having good practices can be a kind of guard against AI degrading the quality of your code base. And so the practices aren't new, but it is more data that these practices are good things for us to follow. So yeah, that's how I would summarize it is what you do right now has a big impact on the types of outcomes that you see with AI.
Okay. Can we dive deeper into a couple of those results? Because if I was an engineering leader or head of engineering CTO, I would be really interested to hear about those differences. What could I do differently or better, or what should I watch out for?
The number one thing, which is the same for any rollout initiative, is the why. So why are we rolling out AI? What are we hoping to get? And then setting clear expectations for what that means for the team. And one of the comments that really stood out to me from one of the individual contributors we spoke to was her saying, look, I'm not clear right now on what the why is from leadership. And so what I need to do depends based on that. If the why is that they want to make sure that we're keeping our skills sharp because AI is just part of software engineering roles and it'll be part of getting hired in the future, then that's one thing. It leads to one set of outcomes. Or if the why is they want to increase productivity, then that's a different set of outcomes, but I don't know which it is in my organization right now. So that's the first thing, is setting that really clearly for lots of organizations, and the ones where we saw that adoption uptick happen, it often meant that there was an all hands or a moment in time where folks on the leadership side got in front of the room of their engineers and said, hey, here's the goal, here's what we expect. And on the expectation side, it often was as clear as, hey, we do expect that everyone's going to have some kind of an AI learning goal. We expect that everyone's going to be trying AI in some way. So anyway, being really clear about, in this case, we do expect you to be using it. And then that was the good foundation. So that was the first thing. And if that wasn't there, or even in organizations where they did that a bit, we still heard engineers saying, I'm not entirely clear. I still have more questions. So the clarity of goals and then the communication of it was the first step. The second thing that we saw then, and a real interesting bright spot in the paper, was then how do you support people to learn? And this is a big thing that we saw there is there's a real opportunity to support more peer-to-peer learning. This trend was actually so important that we saw it in our first paper, and then it came up again very strongly in our second paper, where we were looking at industry patterns. And so this is one that I feel very confident about, both from the deep dive data and then the industry data that we looked at. And basically, if I back up, what is peer-to-peer learning? It's when someone is saying, hey, here's something I did, in this case with AI. Here's something I built. I tried the latest model. Here's how I've set up my skills, et cetera, et cetera. And then they're sharing it with someone else on their team. And there were a bunch of reasons why engineers were so excited about this. And again, similar to that clarity, even with the peer-to-peer sharing, when organizations were doing it, engineers still wanted more of it. It was something that people could not get enough of. And I think there's a couple of reasons behind that. So let me talk about why I think it matters, and then I can give some examples for what people are doing in peer-to-peer sharing. So in terms of why it matters, one is there's an implicit trust for your peer that you might not have for the CTO. And there was a great quote about this. It was a little bit blunt, but basically one of the people that we interviewed said, an engineer said, look, when a peer tells me I should do it, I know that it's going to make things easier. It's something that will help me in my job. But when the CTO says I should do it, I wonder if it's just that they think they're going to make more money, or that the shareholders will make more money. And so there's a skepticism when leadership says it versus when a peer says, look, I tried something and it worked. So that's the first. There's a trust level. The second is it helps people get past concerns around whether those tools can actually work in your own context. If it's someone who works in a complex code base, maybe there's a lot of legacy code they're dealing with, et cetera, right? Name your thing that might make your code base more complex. If you see that someone else has built something and it was useful and helpful with AI on your own code base, then you already have that example that it's possible. So those were a couple of the reasons that peer-to-peer sharing was so in demand. And then, and I'm actually jumping to the second white paper here because we had so many examples. In terms of the types of activities, there were 3 that popped out as being the most useful on the peer-to-peer side. So one of them, right at the top, was having Slack channels. And if you're on Teams, I'm sorry, you can use a Teams channel. But having Slack channels and a dedicated Slack channel where it's for sharing what people are learning. So this was great. It really supported the day-to-day kind of little bits of learning, which actually was the third reason peer-to-peer sharing is so helpful, because the pace of change is so fast that even trying to do a playbook or have some kind of defined thing, it's just going to get out of date. And so instead, having little tidbits of information as something, a new model drops or someone figures out a new way of working, that keeps it really active and it keeps the learning alive. So that was the first one, Slack channels.
I find it really useful because those tools being non-deterministic, you really need to learn from each other, and you really need to almost get anecdotal. And I use this prompt and I changed this from that, and that's how it improved. And that you can learn, I will try it again in my prompt, because it's not just you learn an algorithm and it's going to work the same way. You need those built-in experience and knowledge. You need to get the experience with knowledge. And you need both. While sometimes with some parts of the software engineering, you just need knowledge and then you can just code it and that's it. I think that experience here is even more important.
That's a great point. And what I think is most interesting about the Slack channels is how you get them started. And it's the same with any type of community building. Once you get it to a critical mass, it's self-sustaining. But what we saw when you're starting with nothing, if you don't have one of those channels yet, you need to get it going.
Yes.
And so something that we saw across a couple different organizations in the interviews was that leaders, rather than them posting all the time, they would look for the other people doing interesting things and then nudge them. And so that got other people comfortable with sharing. It also showed that it was more than just the leader who was playing with these tools. So anyway, that was the key thing that we really saw there in terms of get other people sharing. And then once it's at critical mass, it doesn't need so much nurturing. So that was one. A second peer-to-peer example that we saw was experience sharing sessions. So the key here was having them be recurring and regular. And so that might mean a weekly AI demo. For us at Multitudes, actually, it's just we have weekly demos anyway. And so now it's just show us how you use AI as part of that. And so for many people, there might be rituals that you already have that can flow into really nicely. For some, it was specific AI sharing sessions. But whatever it is, having a time where people can jump in, do that demonstration of here's what I tried, here's what worked, and here's what didn't. So those were some examples of the peer-to-peer sharing and why people love it so much.
I can see the same at our organization when we do have quite a lot of this peer sharing, and I think that helps build that community and also see other people are trying it. And why couldn't I try it? Or now I can see what's possible. I also wanted to try it out. I think that helps quite a lot.
And validating, just something else on that too, validating the times that it doesn't work. So that came up in some of the quotes that we had in the survey and the interviews around people being able to share what they don't like about AI, what worries them. Again, I've seen this in my team, people jumping in and saying, hey, I tried this and it didn't work. And then people, just the example you were giving, maybe workshopping a prompt or a skill or something together. That we know exactly like you said, it's not deterministic, it's not magical, it doesn't work all the time. And so actually it's the problem solving of wrangling the AI to do what you want.
Okay, so you mentioned that there is some new research coming, follow-up research. So I think let's go there because I'm really curious. This research hasn't been published yet, so it's almost hot from the press. Tell us more what it is, when it's going to be published, and what was some of the highlights.
Yeah, I'll do that. Let me there's one last thread I want to do from the first paper that I said I would come back to, which is the 2 impact metrics that were consistent. So across the door metrics, we looked at things like change lead time, deployment frequency, change failure rate. And then we looked at some of the more space indicators around on the satisfaction side, well-being side, how often people were working long hours, collaboration patterns, etc. And across all of that, as I was mentioning before, we saw very different patterns, except with 2 metrics. So the 2 where it was consistent was when organizations rolled out AI, pretty consistently, we saw, first of all, an increase in how frequently they were merging their PRs. And we also saw, so it was a 27.2% increase in how many PRs were getting merged, like post AI compared to before. But the caveat is alongside that, the second most consistent trend was that we saw people doing more out of hours commits. So there was a 19.6 increase in out of hours commits. So the thing that we can say here, we didn't run a randomized controlled trial. There's lots of factors here. But this certainly, I think we can argue that part of that increase in the number of PRs getting merged is not just AI. It is also people putting in time at hours that they weren't putting in time before, putting in time more in evenings and weekends. And what we really saw this came out very organically in the surveys and the interviews, was the delivery pressures that people are feeling. And just the load of having existing delivery pressures, plus trying to keep up with AI on top of that. It's just a lot that people are being expected to do. And the said thing here is there is a lot of uncertainty. It is quite overwhelming. And so it's not just the how do I get the work done. There might be some worries or some other feelings that people are trying to navigate throughout all of this too.
Could I add maybe a different perspective to this? Because certainly there is delivery pressure and we now are asked to do more with less or more with AI. But I also noticed, certainly for myself, but I could see it in the community, that for many people, AI reignited their passion for software and they brought us back to being hands-on coding. So I wonder if maybe, and I don't think that's necessarily for a lot of people, but for some people, they may actually be doing coding at night or over the weekend because they just want to try it out. They want to spend more time with code because it's more fun now or it's different. And I wonder if that adds to that picture.
Yeah, I'm smiling because this is, whenever I share this data, and I've shared it around the world, we've had some dinners with folks in several different countries at this point discussing the data. That's the number one guess from engineering leaders is, but aren't they putting in this time because it's so fun? And I think part of it is I know that the experience for many engineering leaders is maybe you were off the tools and AI has now made it more possible to be back on the tools, and it's exciting and it makes it feel easy and faster and whatever it is. So I think that if we haven't done this data slice, if I slice the data just for engineering leaders, I think it could be the case. It might even pop out at the top. But and that was true certainly for some engineers, but the number one theme that came up in what they told us in the survey and in what they told us in the interviews was the delivery pressure side. And I think the difference.
Oh, I love that. It's mine too. I can see the delivery pressure for sure. I probably was weighing up more because of a bias. That's what it is for me. So it's great to have research and have numbers, and see that's what it's for. So it's amazing. Good.
That's fair. Yeah. And again, that certainly was true for some engineers too. It just wasn't the number one theme that came up in our analysis.
Cool.
So,
very good.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So part two. So in part one, we went for depth. We had those 4 organizations, 10 months, multiple different data sources. And then part two of the research, what we wanted to do was get was breadth. So say, look, we found these insights initially, and we want to validate how true is this across a broad set of organizations around the world. And then the second thing we wanted to do in part two was dive deeper into the specific tactics that organizations are using. Of course, in that first set of research, we had 500 engineers, but it was across 4 organizations. Now we wanted to see across hundreds of organizations, what is it that's working and not working? And so the way that we got to that was we ran an industry survey, first of all. So that was running, one thing I'll note is that ran both before and after the big model improvements that happened end of November, beginning of December. So that was an interesting thing for us to consider when we were doing the analysis. We had 226 engineering leaders around the world fill that out. And then we did a follow-up of 10 interviews, and we did those in March. And the reason we did them in March, literally right before we published the paper, people listening to this in the future, the paper is out, the second paper is out, but right now when we're doing this interview, we're about to go publish this paper in an hour. And our last interview was literally last Friday. So we did our best. There's some interesting questions here about how you keep research up with the pace of change of AI. But the reason we did all these interviews right now is we wanted to make sure that in our deep dives, we were getting perspectives about how the world looks now since the shifts that we've seen since December, and obviously the even newer models that have come out like 4.6 and 5.3 since then too in 2026. So anyway, that was an interesting challenge, but yes, hundreds of responses across organizations. And again, we supplemented that with interviews so that we could really dive deep. So that's what we did. Yeah.
Results?
The results, yes. Yeah, one that I hinted at, which is we saw yet again, and actually with even more data, how important that peer-to-peer sharing is. So we've spoken about that one a little bit. The bigger thing that we saw around that, though, is we're really moving from this period where initially it was just, hey, we'll throw some money at AI, let's get our teams just playing with it. And ultimately, we just want to know, are people using it? And that is a logical first stage because we need to use it before we can figure out how to get more from it. But now, especially in some of the pressures and the asks that engineering leaders spoke about from their boards, we are starting to see that shift from not just are people using AI, have we adopted it, to what kinds of outcomes are we actually getting from it. And the other thing along that, what it really shows is it's not just a one-off shift. It's not just did we roll out AI tooling. We've now seen so many model and tooling changes that we know actually the ground is just constantly changing underneath us at this point. It's not, and maybe at some point it'll settle down, but not in the near future here. And so where we really landed with this is the importance of building organizations that are designed for ongoing learning and continuous improvement. Because at an organizational level, we don't know what the changes will be, but we do know that change is here and it's continuing to come. And so we can at least plan for that. And that means things like making sure that people have time to learn. That was one of the biggest barriers when we asked what slowed down your AI usage in your organization. That takes us back to the delivery pressures we heard people talk about, and how do you make sure that you're keeping up with all the new changes alongside that? And it's, again, part of why that peer-to-peer sharing is so useful, because with peer-to-peer sharing, you can effectively get little microdoses of learning that you embed throughout the day-to-day. So that was one key thing. We need to figure out what are the structures and the systems that really support ongoing learning? So that was one.
So before we go to the second one,
yeah.
I wonder if what I'm hearing here is that all of them or many of the things that we've been talking about for the last 20 years about some communities and then continuous learning, continuous improvement, like all of those small changes and like all of those things, TDD, like all of those practices that we've been trying to embed. Yeah, pairing is, extreme programming, basically.
Yes.
Extreme programming and feedback loops. This is more and more important. So I think we've been preparing ourselves for this moment.
Yes, I think that's right. And that several people pointed that out in the research as well. We've got a quote in the paper, which is effectively that saying, yeah, this is extreme programming. It's more reason than ever to follow the practices of extreme programming. So yes, I think that's true. And I'm not the first to say this. The thing that's a little bit sad is why is the machine, is AI enough for us to do this when people weren't? But the practical side of me says, do you know what? Doesn't matter why. If this is going to push us to follow good practices, then that's enough. Let's just run with that.
Yeah, nice. Okay, I interrupt you. What were some of the second or third results?
Yeah. And alongside that, one of the things that really surprised me, to be honest, is when we asked what kinds of changes are you making to make sure that you're adapting to AI or to protect code-based quality in the face of AI. One of the things that was really surprising was that most of the time people were thinking about tooling and code-based changes rather than people and process changes. And from what we were just saying, we need to think about the processes and the human structures to support learning. In our first paper, we saw if you don't get the human stuff right in terms of the structure of why we're doing this, the enablement activities, then you don't see as much adoption. And so we keep seeing in the data these reasons why the people and process side is really important. But in practice, people are focusing on the tooling and the code-based changes. And I think it's more clear. Like everyone knows, have a markdown file, maybe have several. Are you using Claude Skills? There's these things that we know and they're really discrete, whereas of course human change is always a little bit more fuzzy and a little bit harder. So it makes sense. But what I will say if we flip it is, in most organizations, there's probably an opportunity for them to get more from AI by pausing and thinking a little bit more about that people and process side. So that's just a flow on from that previous finding about we need to build a learning organization. And to do that well, we're going to have to focus more on our people practices.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the mantra in technology. There's sorts of people, process, and technologies at the end. You just throw tools at people. That's going to work not as much or as well as you want it to work. So start with people and process and then technology. Yeah,
exactly. And then the other one that was really surprising, particularly for us as a company that's working in the space of engineering metrics, is that people know what outcomes they want from AI, but they're really struggling to measure it. So the types of outcomes are not surprising. In general, it's things like productivity. People would sometimes mention or things like we want to reduce the amount of tedious work, freeing people up for some of the bigger thinking, et cetera, et cetera. But what was surprising was the struggles around measuring it, especially on the engineering productivity side, given the number of frameworks we've had come out. Feels, especially in recent years, there's maybe a new engineering productivity framework every year. And yet people are still struggling to measure this when it comes to AI. And so what was interesting is there were a couple patterns that came out in the survey and interview responses around why this is. One is in some cases, people didn't feel like they had appropriate baseline metrics before they started bringing in AI and making changes. And so there wasn't an appropriate pre and post. And they could see people in their organizations starting to lean more on the anecdotes and perception. And again, I'll keep going back to, for all the flaws of the meter study, what was really interesting was you had almost exactly opposite responses from this survey they ran, where people said 20% more productive, and the telemetry data where they were 19% less productive. Yeah. And so people know in our research, people know that we need to be really careful when we're using perception to measure productivity, but when they didn't have good productivity metrics, then that was something I struggled with. So that was one part of it. But the other part that I think is really interesting here, there are two things that are unique challenges that have come up with AI around this too. So one is how do you isolate the impact of AI from everything else that's always changing? So that was one. People pointing out rightfully, you shouldn't just compare the metrics for the people using AI less than the people using AI more, because the 100% there's selection bias and there's reasons one group is using it more than the other. So that was one. The second thing was this point that actually the role of engineers is fundamentally shifting. And we saw this in our paper as well. Engineers now moving more into product work. In some companies, that's actually become the blocker, right? Is there's not enough product work. And so you can build the thing faster, but if you haven't done the research to know what you need to build, then you're stuck there. And so companies responding, and I've seen this in several places, by having engineers jump in and do more of the discovery work and talking to customers, et cetera. But that's not in any engineering productivity framework, because those always started with the ticket or picking up, starting to actually put your fingers to a keyboard and write some code. And that's not, that we're now looking well before that. And so I do think there's some really interesting questions with really important implications for the work that we do in our own product around what are the new metrics we need to look at. First of all, when you can't run a randomized controlled trial, still get a better sense of what's the likely causal impact of something. And I have a strong opinion on this, so I'll come back to that. But also, the one that I don't have, that I'm still figuring out my thoughts on, is what are the new metrics we need to look at to actually look at this new life cycle for engineers, which starts with discovery and idea generation. And sorry, I know I've talked a lot, but I just want to go back to that point then around this, how do we tease out the impact of AI? And in a prior life, I was on an economics PhD pathway, and I came off it because I, along the way, realized after doing some research, I liked the applied side. But if you can't run a randomized controlled trial, economics is the field to look at, because economists can't go and tell a politician, hey, I'd like you to apply this policy here, but not here. To deal with the real world. And so there's a couple of methods within econometrics that are useful for these types of cases. And one of them, it's basically a kind of watered down differences from econometrics. But one approach is to say, okay, we can't run a randomized control trial, but if we want to understand the impact just of rolling out AI, but any AI experiment, let's say we decided we're doing a weekly AI demo, and we want to see what that does, not only for AI usage, but also for some of the door metrics as an outcome measure. What we can do, first of all, is say, let's look at before and after, because there were probably pre-existing things happening. So we want to net out what was true before and see what changed. And then the other thing we can do is think about a fuzzy treatment versus control and look at who's using AI more, or who would have had more of that intervention applied. Maybe you do have a few teams that try something first and others don't. That's a great treatment versus control. If it went out to everybody, though, maybe you look at the people who are using AI more versus less, and then you net out those differences. And anyway, long story short, by netting out some of those differences, both before and after, and then trying to get some kind of a treatment and control, you can start to get a better view of what was the impact of this AI rollout or this AI experiment.
I think that even that approach requires discipline and putting your biases aside. Even that conversation we had 10 minutes ago, what I think is happening, and you're like, no, the data actually shows something else. So I think that it's still important to make sure that you don't fall into the trap of just using your perceptions. I think, so thank you for sharing that and a different approach to seeing or to measuring the impact, because I think that many of the businesses in New Zealand and around the world, they are going to try and find and also argue why do you want to spend more on AI, because I think we can be spending so much money. Even the Cloud Max plan is $200 a month. If you multiply it by number of engineers, it actually adds up quite quickly. So the question is, what are we getting from it? Because yes, we can throw more money at it, but how do we then go to your CFO and say, I'm going to spend this amount of money, and he or she is going to ask, what are we getting out of it? My people are faster. So what? How much faster? And is it worth it? Are they faster in the right place? What's the outcome for the customer? What's the outcome for our revenue? And then you're actually adding more costs, but what about the top line? So I think that's all. Any way we can measure the impact, I think that's going to be useful for people.
Yeah. And I will say, just on that one, the discipline, et cetera, the honest answer is, once you have the data, and we have the data with multitudes, but anyone collecting telemetry data has that data, then it's just math.
Yeah.
And for multitudes, for example, that's a feature we have. You can say, hey, here's an intervention we rolled out on this date. And then we do the math and we tell you pre, post, and experiment and control. But anyone could do it. We're always very open in our docs about how we did things. And so if anyone else wants to go build something themselves, like, we don't mind. We do. My main thing, this is my personal pet peeve, I've just seen too many of the comparisons where people look at the metrics for your higher AI users, and then they look at the metrics for your lower AI users, and they say, this is AI. And there's so many confounding factors that mean that it's not. So anyway, please, if you can at all avoid it, don't do that. And yeah, we've shared some thoughts on other methods. There are others out there, but yeah, please just don't do that.
I'm guessing a lot of the people listening to this, they are now interested in going deeper into the research papers. Where can they find them?
www.multitudes.com/research. And you can see there at the top, we've got both the newest paper. So that's the second AI impact white paper. That's the one where we had the industry survey. We really dive into practices. And then you'll also see the first one where we had all that telemetry data, and we could see what drives adoption and what was the impact on productivity and quality and well-being.
On behalf of the New Zealand community and kind of worldwide community, I guess, thank you for doing that research. I think it is really important, especially in the emerging world that we are in right now, because it's something different when you do the research when something is already established. It's also different methods, but the impact, I think, is not as much as what you do right now. And there's so many unknowns and people are struggling and trying to find the answers. I think what you do and what Multitudes do is really important for all of us. So, big thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to say that back at you too, because I think especially now, everyone is feeling overwhelmed and behind. Even one of the organizations, I spoke to the person who is literally out of 250 engineers, the #1 Cloud Code user. And even that engineer feels behind.
Yeah.
And so the importance of community and us sharing and teaching each other through this is more important than ever. So thank you for all that you do with TechWaka.
Thank you. Right. Thank you so much for the conversation. Maybe we can have another one in a few months' time, see how the research evolves. Thank you.
Happy to. Thanks. Take care.
That was Lauren Peate from Multitudes. If you want to dig deeper into the research, head to multitudes.com/research. All the results can be found over there. I think that the thing that stuck most with me from this conversation is that we tend to keep looking for the answer in the tooling, but the data keeps pointing back to people and leadership. Set the why, give people the time to learn, get your best users sharing with everyone else, and actually measure what's happening, not what you think is happening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the TechWaka podcast wherever you're listening to your podcasts, and I will see you in the next one.
A special thanks to our sponsor, Wires Uncrossed, helping teams across New Zealand, Australia and beyond untangle software delivery and build systems that truly perform. We're grateful for their support in making this conversation possible. Check them out at wiresuncrossed.co.nz.